Greetings. This is MBA 522, and this lecture is part of Module 3, the interpersonal skills that we need to have to be able to make good decisions. And one of the issues that are incredibly important when we're making good decisions is critical thinking skills and problem solving. So we're going to go through what the critical thinking process should look like. It parallels the decision-making process, but what it requires you to do is go a bit deeper and not just sit at the surface, but actually dig in deeper and think much more in depth and with a more critical eye to be able to determine whether or not the decision we're about to make makes good sense. So we'll go through that process. We'll talk about some of the barriers to good critical thinking, and then ultimately how this helps us to solve problems that are in front of us, to be able to make those good decisions. So what does it mean to have critical thinking skills? And as you can see, there's a long checklist of items that we should consider. Number one is this idea of inquisitiveness. To be inquisitive means to be curious and to want to learn and understand things. And so if you want to be a critical thinker, it requires you to be curious, to be inquisitive, and to ask questions about a wide range of issues. The second item is concern, that you have to be concerned in order to want to become well informed about something. So if you want to learn more, and if you are concerned about things, then that will encourage you to learn as much as you can about something. The third item is alertness. Alertness to opportunities to use critical thinking. And what that means is you've got to be mindful, you've got to be present, so that when you're looking at something and you recognize that it requires you to dig a little bit deeper and to think a little bit more with a critical eye to understand something. But you have to be aware that you want to do that, and you have to be aware of when those opportunities arise where it makes sense to engage in critical thinking. You have to have self-confidence in your abilities to reason. Now, we're not talking about an inflated self-confidence where our ego is really driving it and we're not honestly being honest with ourselves about our ability to reason. As we already know from the decision-making bias chapter, it's not uncommon for people to engage in a lot of inflated overconfidence about their ability to do things when in fact they're not being very realistic at all. So what we want is self-confidence, but we also want it to be reasonable and measured. So that you should be able to feel good about your ability to reason. And if you don't feel good about your ability to reason, you should have a willingness to learn how to engage in better reasoning skills. That's the whole point of, I guess the whole point of this module is to help you in that position to be able to do that. You need to be open-minded. It doesn't mean you're necessarily going to change your mind, but critical thinking does open us up to having to think about divergent worldviews. And how do we recognize that even though I've always believed in X, how could Y be possible? Is it possible that some of my assumptions were off? Is it possible that I haven't thought thoroughly about all the issues that are at play, and therefore the assumptions that I had going into this might not be the correct assumptions, or they might not be all of the assumptions that I need to take into consideration. So in order for us to be critical thinkers, we have to be ready and open to divergent worldviews and to have an open mind. We need to be flexible. We need to be able to be flexible in terms of thinking through alternatives and flexible in our opinions, being willing to say, I didn't know that, and now I learned something new, and thank you for teaching me that. And so our flexibility requires us, if we want to be good critical thinkers, it requires us to really be open to different alternatives, different opinions, and be open-minded, as we already said in the previous point, to those divergent views. We want to seek to understand the opinions of others. So asking people to explain why they think what they think, what are the reasons, what are the assumptions that they're making. This is not to do it in the form of an attack. This is to do this in the form of, how do I reach across the gap and actually understand what it is that someone is trying to say. There's a very big difference between attacking someone going, well, I don't understand. You tell me what to do. Tell me what you're thinking and why do you think that way? It's ridiculous. You shouldn't think that way. That's putting people on the defensive. What you really want to be doing is something to the effect of, I'm trying to understand why you believe that. I really have an honest and open mind about it. I would love to understand your reasoning, and figuring out how I can perhaps learn something from you, or, um, you know, find a way to find a common ground with you. And that is the goal, really, of any kind of critical thinking, is not to assume that I'm right and you're wrong, or vice versa, but that we try to figure out that there's going to be nuggets of truth in what everybody has to say. Is it possible that we have common goals, but maybe just have different paths for achieving them? Certainly that's possible. So our goal is to seek to understand the other, not to critique, and to criticize, but to try to understand. And you cannot critique anything if you don't understand it to the first place. So it's important that we fully understand where people are coming from, what their reasoning is, why it's important to them, in order for us then to find out how to have that meeting of the minds. Fair-mindedness in appraising your reasoning, and being fair and being honest with yourself where you think you might be biased. Being aware of our own biases then helps us to be more fair-minded, because we recognize our own flaws and our own biases and things like that. And that leads us then to the honesty issue, which is being honest about our own biases and prejudices and stereotypes and egocentric tendencies. And I think we would all be fooling ourselves if we thought that we don't have any prejudices or stereotypes, because we do. All of us do. I know I do. And I think I'm a pretty sort of, I'm a pretty good critical thinker, and I believe that I have an open mind about a whole host of things. And I still know that there are prejudices that I hold inside, even if it's just the conditioning that I've had from society about how to react to something or how to think about something. And I think we have to own that we have our own biases and points of view and stereotypes that we engage in, even if it's unconscious, that it's there. We want to have prudence when it comes to actually making a judgment about something, that we are recognizing that we may be biased, that we maybe have unconscious stereotypes and prejudices that are influencing the way that we're making a decision. So we want to make sure we are not jumping to conclusions, and we're not being judgmental without, recognizing that there's going to be some sort of balance in there, right? That we want to suspend any judgments we have and truly have that open mind to hear what people have to say. The last point is a willingness to reconsider and revise. That's the thing about critical thinking. If you're not willing to reconsider and revise, then you're really not engaging in critical thinking. Critical thinking skills requires us to check in with ourselves, to check our assumptions, to be open-minded, to be flexible, to seek to understand what others have to say, to be honest about our own strengths and weaknesses, and being fair in the way that we approach things. And if we don't do all those things, and we're still not willing, and if we're not willing to reconsider and revise the way we think about stuff, then we're not engaging in that critical thinking at all. I think it's incredibly important to recognize that, our points of view, our opinions are not static, that they're dynamic, and that the world changes, and that we need to be able to make adjustments accordingly. So I really liked this graphic. Critical thinking is about getting a working consensus, purposeful, reflective judgment which manifests itself in reasoned consideration of all the evidence, the context, the methods, the standards, the conceptualizations, in deciding what to believe and what to do. So what that comes down to is it has to be purposeful. We have to reflect on ourselves and others. We don't want to jump to conclusions and jump to judgments, but we're going to be reasoning through things by balancing stuff like the evidence, the facts that are in front of us, the context within which something is manifesting itself. What methods were used to collect the information, recognizing where there might be biases attached to that. What standards do we set for quality? And how are we conceptualizing, and what assumptions are we making when we're doing something? So, we use all of these tools then to help us to decide what to believe and what to do. There's a 5-step critical thinking process involved here. Step 1 is identifying the problem and setting the priorities. 2 is to determine relevant information to deepen our understanding. 3 is enumerating our options and anticipating consequences. 4 is assessing the situation and making a preliminary decision. And then 5 is to scrutinize the process and self-correct as needed. Now notice that all of this sounds very similar to the rational decision-making model we talked about, in the first week. And yeah, you're right, because rational decision-making is the core, the frame within which we do critical thinking. So again, critical thinking parallels the rational decision process because it requires us to identify the problems, determine the information, enumerate the options, make our decision, and then evaluate in the long run. Although, I think it's important for us to recognize that we have to go deeper, that it's not just the surface decision process, that we do truly have to question things and identify them. And so what I'm going to go through now as we go through these different items is I'm going to help and push you to go a little bit deeper, to ask questions at each step of this process so that we truly can figure out whether or not we're doing the right thing in terms of setting up our decision process. So taking into account those 5 steps as we talked about, there are 6 important critical thinking skills that we need to be able to engage in the critical thinking process. Number 1, we have to be able to interpret information. We have to do analysis. We have to be able to dig in deeper and analyze what it is that we're looking at. We have to make inferences, making associations between something we learned before and something we learned now to extend our understanding of things. We need to evaluate whether or not our assumptions were correct. We need to be able to make explanations, and we need self-regulation in terms of how we regulate ourselves, our biases, our emotions, all those sorts of things. One of the first important skill sets is interpretation. And the importance of interpretation is how we comprehend the information in front of us. What kind of meaning or significance do we give to that information? And we gather meaning and significance through our experiences, through the situations, the data that we have in front of us, the judgments that we're making, the social conventions that are out there, how we're supposed to see things. So we start to interpret things based on these things, but it's important for us to recognize that oftentimes our judgments, the conventions, our beliefs, all these sorts of things have a bias attached to them because of the way society tells us that we're supposed to see things and we're supposed to understand things. And so it is important for us as we're interpreting something or trying to apply some sort of meaning or significance to something that we need to see it through a more critical eye and not just take it for granted, right? We've got to ask the right questions. And here's a bunch of really good questions to ask. What does this mean? What's happening? How should we understand this? What is the best way to characterize or categorize this? In context, what was that person trying to communicate to us? If we take something out of context, that's going to be really problematic for us when we're trying to justify why we're doing things. Lastly, how can we make sense out of this, which is based on our feelings, our experiences, or on facts, factual data. So interpretation is key here. That's where we start at the top with interpretation, but we have to recognize that it can be incredibly biased based on our judgments and conventions and experiences. With analysis, what we're trying to do is to identify the relationships amongst all of the data and the information and the concepts that we're trying to understand. So we may have a bunch of data, but can we see patterns? Can we see associations? Can we see things that that are meaningful in the way that things are being expressed? So we want to figure out what is the intended expression, the intended belief, the intended experiences and reasons that someone is justifying something. And so analysis is about us asking the questions, right? Tell me what your reasons are. Why are you concluding this? What is it that you're trying to conclude? Why do you think that way? So you're making an argument. What do you think are the pros and cons of your argument? What assumptions should we make to accept that conclusion? What are the assumptions that you're making when you're coming to that conclusion? What information do you have? What is the basis for which you're making a particular decision? So analysis is where we really truly dig in, and we don't assume anything. We have to ask the questions, and we want to make sure that we understand what are the arguments, what are the assumptions, et cetera, et cetera. With inference, what we're trying to do is to identify what we need to know to be able to draw reasonable conclusions so that we can create hypotheses, test those hypotheses, and figure out whether or not something is working the way it's supposed to work. We want to make sure we have relevant information, and we want to make sure the information that we're using is not going to have that we are going to understand the information we're using in terms of what are the judgments and beliefs and biases that may be embedded in some of those things that we're asking. So again, a bunch of really great questions to ask. Given what we know so far, what can we conclude? Given what we know so far, what can we rule out? What does this evidence imply? If we have this evidence, what does it actually mean? What are we assuming? What is assumed underneath that? If we abandon or accepted that assumption, how does things change? So as we say, this is our assumption, we can say, well, this is the assumption, this is the conclusion we would draw. And then we can say, are there any other reasonable assumptions that can be made? What if we made a different assumption? What if we assumed B instead of A? Would we then still be able to draw the same conclusions? So we have to figure out where the assumptions are drawn and assume whether or not they are generally accepted assumptions, whether they're factual, or whether they are simply someone's opinions. If it's someone's opinion, then you can dismantle, right, the assumptions and try to draw stronger assumptions based on data and hard evidence. Other questions that we could ask. What additional information do we need to resolve the question? If we believe these things, what would they imply for us going forward? So, okay, we agree to something. So what does that mean for us in the short term and in the long term, in the near term and in the far term? What are the consequences of doing things that way? What are some alternatives we haven't explored yet? So alternative explanations, alternative assumptions. Let's consider each option that we have in front of us with some detail and figure out whether these different options lead us in different directions and these different assumptions lead us in different directions. Are there any undesirable consequences that we can see and should foresee? So are we really allowing ourselves to think about the worst case scenario that could happen with a basic assumption? Sometimes we are so quick to make a decision and we're eager to reinforce the decisions that we're making that we forget that we need to really reconcile what the long-term impact may be about a decision that we make. And oftentimes people forget about, like, for example, environmental impact on things. So we're making this tough decision and we're going to do this and we're not going to think about, well, what impact is that going to have on our local air, our local water, our local soil? What impact is this going to have on jobs? What impact is this going to have on the tax base for the community? There's all sorts of things, and because we tend to want to make decisions quickly, we don't always think about what would be the undesirable consequence of something that we want to do. At the evaluation step, what we're trying to do is assess the credibility of the information that we're using. So the goal here is, if someone's making a claim about something, is it verifiable? Is it logical? Does it make sense? Are we being biased by logical fallacies and things of that nature? Can we trust the person where the information is coming from? Um, and even if we can't trust the person, is it possible still that that information may still be true? Again, people can be untrustworthy, but they may actually have accurate information that they're communicating with you. So we have to make sure we're clear about that relationship between someone who's trustworthy and whether or not the information is trustworthy. We want to make sure that we've got the facts correct. How confident are we that our conclusions are correct, et cetera, et cetera. So all of these are important questions to ask as we are evaluating something, is making sure that the information that we're using is reasonable and usable and something that we can rely on. So with explanation, our goal is to be able to explain or to justify or to make a cogent argument for the reasoning that we are going to provide to support something. So when someone's in explanation mode, it's okay to ask questions, and because we want to make sure that we are critically analyzing every aspect of the decision process. So we might ask questions like, what are the specific findings or the results from the investigation? Not just the summary of what you concluded from it, but what are those specific results? Because it's possible that someone erroneously concluded something from a study, and that if you actually had the data and the results themselves, you could draw your own conclusions about what that means. You want to ask someone how they conducted their analysis. So if they've done an analysis, great. What's the process that they used? How did they come to that interpretation? What were their assumptions? Please take us through your reasoning one more time. Again, we're asking people to share their reasoning so that it makes sense. Why do you think something? Why do you think this was the right answer or the right solution? Asking them to justify and to explain it in a reasonable way. How would you explain why this particular decision was made? So again, if people made a decision, let's go through what that decision process was. What did we do? Why did we do it? Why did we choose to do this? And did it make sense to do it that way? In terms of self-regulating is where we monitor our cognitive abilities and all the aspects that we used in our decision process. And so when we are looking at someone's self-regulation, we're going to be asking really clear questions because we want to make sure we have clarity about what's going on. So some questions that you might ask, our position on this issue is still too vague. Can we be more precise? So we are being aware or mindful of the fact that we may not have enough clarity to be able to support our arguments, or enough clear information or precise information to help someone to understand what it is that we are concluding, or what it is that we're asserting. We can ask ourselves, how good was our methodology? How well did we follow it? We set up a methodology. Did we follow it well? We can ask ourselves, is there a way we can reconcile these two apparently conflicting conclusions? So critical thinking is saying, well, we have this as a possible conclusion, and we can also conclude this. How do we reconcile why those two conclusions might be equally as reasonable? We want to ask ourselves, how good was our evidence before we commit? What are we missing? If we are unclear about definitions, we can ask about definitions. These are just potential questions that we can ask. But the whole process of self-regulation is to evaluate our own inferential judgment when we're thinking about questioning or confirming or correcting, our reason or somebody else's reasoning or somebody else's results. So self-monitoring and being self-aware is a really important part of critical thinking. If we're not going to be willing to put ourselves out there to recognize that we might be making mistakes, this is going to be a problem for us sort of in the long haul. So in terms of critical thinking, there are all sorts of barriers or obstacles that we can have in critical thinking. Number one can be in logical fallacies. And as you can saw on a number of these points on critical thinking skills that we need, if we are abiding by or engaging in the use of fallacious arguments, that's going to not contribute to our ability to persuade others to our ideas and our points. And so logical fallacies become the bedrock upon which the whole argument falls apart. And we're going to go through some logical fallacies in a few minutes here. Biases in gathering data, in the assumptions that we're using, and the conclusions that we're drawing, bias all through the process, the critical thinking process, the decision-making process. Bias happens at all steps. So I love this really huge list of critical fallacies. There are many more that can be included on this, but these are some of the most common, and some that are the most challenging, of course, for us to get away from. Um, and I'll just read through the list really quick. A straw man argument, appeal to the person or an ad hominem attack, an appeal to popularity, an appeal to tradition, genetic fallacies, equivocation, appeal to ignorance, false dilemmas, begging the question, hasty generalization, slippery slopes, compositions, and division. So the slides that are going to follow, I'm going to let them sit for maybe 15 seconds each so you can read them, understand them. And if you want to pause the video while you are going through and reviewing each of these, by all means, go ahead so you can read them. But I figured if I give each slide about 15 seconds, to proceed, you should be able to read through the cartoons or the little graphics that are there in order for you to better understand what each of these critical fallacies mean. So there are some rules of thumb for how we can improve our own critical thinking. Number one, we have to be practiced in asking basic questions. What do you already know? How do you know it? Why do you know it? What are we trying to prove or disprove? What are we overlooking? Even if you go to these really simple basic questions, that will be a step in the right direction towards a more in-depth critical analysis of anything that it is you're trying to undertake. Question assumptions. Even if it's a basic assumption, always push yourself to think, is there a different assumption? Is there a different conclusion that we can draw? Are there different assumptions that we've missed? Or is this even a relevant assumption anymore? Beware of your own biases, your own mental shortcuts and things of that nature and where they come into play. And then reversing things, right? If we assume that X causes Y, what if it really is Y causing X? The interesting thing on this is this is how we understand, motivation and satisfaction in the workplace. For years, people thought happy workers were good performers, when in fact, it's the reverse. When they're good performers, they're much more likely to be happy and satisfied. So we thought X caused Y, but in fact, we realized that if you help the employee to become a better performer, they actually become more happy on the job. So I think it is important for us to practice these 4 basic steps: asking the questions, make sure we're questioning all of our assumptions, be checking in with ourselves and our own mental processing, and also rethinking, turning what we're thinking on its head by reversing the order in which we're associating things. And maybe it's really Y causing X, not X causing Y. There are a few tools that we can use to help us with critical thinking. Number one is checklists. And checklists can really help us by enabling us to take things out of our frontal cortex and putting them in the checklist, things that are important, but that take up mental space, so that if we don't have the checklist to make sure that we are following through on those individual items that are required to be done, if we're holding that checklist in our head, it makes it difficult for us to comprehend things outside of our basic assumptions. We're more likely to be prone to biases. We're more likely to engage in what we call self-fulfilling prophecies, and confirmation bias and things of that nature. So, because our brain gets very overloaded when we have a lot of things that we're trying to analyze. The checklist takes out the essential things that can easily be put into a checklist, so that our brain doesn't have to hold on to that information. Our brain is then free to be open to new ideas and new ways of thinking about things. But we should always be looking at our checklist to make sure that checklist is valid too. Mindfulness. Mindfulness also helps us in terms of our own self-evaluation, the way that we can evaluate and the assumptions that we make about what others are thinking. These are all important keys to improve, and we're going to talk about mindfulness later on in the term. And brainstorming. Critical brainstorming can help with critical thinking because it enables us to think of lots of alternatives and lots of conclusions. And the more that we can brainstorm, the better off we are in terms of being able to be more critical thinkers. And we'll talk more about brainstorming as we get to Module 5. Lastly, one of the best ways for us to develop problem-solving skills is, first of all, to focus on the solution and not the problem. So think about, how do we come up with a solution? How do we come up with a solution? We always want to ask ourselves the question why. And for every time we answer the question, can we ask why again? And why brings us back step by step. So something happened. Well, why did that happen? Well, it happened because of this reason. Well, why did that reason happen? Well, it happened for this reason. Well, why did that reason happen? We can work ourselves backwards to find the source of the problem. If we don't go back to the source of the problem, we're not going to get rid of the problem. The problem is going to repeat itself. We want to keep things really simple. Occam's razor tells us, right, that the simple solution is usually the most logical and most reasonable solution out there. So it is important that we simplify and try not to make things more complex than they need to be. We want to also list out as many alternatives or solutions as possible, because again, if we're not thinking as thoroughly as we can about the potential solutions to the problem, it's going to be incredibly difficult to solve the problem. We also want to be able to think laterally, right? You can't dig a hole in a different place if all you're doing is digging deeper. So what we mean by this is if you keep going down and down and down, you're not digging multiple holes, you're just digging one big hole. So we need to be thinking outside of that comfort zone of that potential solution and come up with a very different solution, digging a different hole in a different place to see if that assumption or that solution makes any degree of sense. And lastly, using language that's about possibility. What if? What if we did this? And what if we did that? And that's how we really fully develop our critical thinking and problem solving skills, by asking ourselves really important questions, particularly being open to the possibility of something new and exciting.